And we are live.
Yes,
Paul,
indeed.
Rich, how are you doing today,
I'm
this
cooling the
evening?
fan, man.
Awesome, awesome.
Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Well, I hope you both had a great weekend, and I hope the chat had a great weekend too. So, I am usually the person behind the scenes, but
Man in
today,
the van specifically.
the man in the van. But today, I'll be taking, I guess you could say, the lead role. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Rich, for giving me this opportunity. And tonight, the Black Comic Lords are so excited to be interviewing the author of the 2021 Eisner Award winning book, Invisible Men, Black Artists
Hey,
of the Golden Age of Comics. For those not familiar with Invisible Men, it contains riveting stories of Black artists who drew, mostly covertly behind the scenes, superhero, horror, and romance comics in the early years of the industry. The life stories of each man's personal struggles and triumphs are represented as they broke through into a world formerly occupied only by whites. Using primary source material from World War II era black newspapers and magazines, this compelling book profiles pioneers like E.C. Stoner, a descendant of one of George Washington's slaves, who became a renowned fine artist of the Harlem Renaissance and the first black artist to draw comic books. Perhaps more fascinating is Owen Middleton, who was sentenced to life in Sing Sing. Middleton's imprisonment became a cause célèbre championed by Will Durant, which led to Middleton's release and subsequent comics career. Then there's Matt Baker, the most revered of the black artists and the topic of tonight's interview, whose exquisite art spotlights stunning women and men, and who drew the first groundbreaking black comic book hero, Vooda. Invisible Men is gorgeously illustrated with rare examples of each artist's work, including full stories from mainstream comic books, from rare titles like All Negro Comics and Negro Heroes, plus unpublished artist photos. Invisible Men features Ken Quattro's impeccable research and lean writing, detailing the social and cultural environments that form these extraordinary yet invisible men. It goes without saying that this Eisner Award winning book, Invisible Men, is required reading for the Black Comic Lord community. So it is our pleasure tonight to have on our show the historian and writer of Invisible Men, Mr. Ken Quattro.
Hi guys, thanks for having me on.
How are you doing today?
So far, so good.
So, as we were saying backstage, we've been talking for a while about having you on the show, picking your brain about, some of these pioneers and just learning from the research you've done, which is quite extensive. So, really happy to have you here.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's always a joy to talk about these guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, just to get things started, could you tell us a little bit about your path to becoming a comic historian, and then what in particular inspired you to write Invisible Men?
Sure. Just like everybody else, I started out as a comic book fan when I was a little kid, and that was in the early 1960s, which basically paralleled the Silver Age of comics. And I grew up with Marvel Comics and everything like that. I'm from the Detroit area, and we had some of the earliest comic conventions. And one of the men who used to run these conventions was a guy named Dr. Jerry Bales. And Jerry Bales is considered by a lot of people to be the godfather of comic book fandom. And one of the things he did was sort of like treat comic books as more than just a child's entertainment. He looked at comic books as more of an art form to be studied, just like any other art form. Well, I picked up from that, and I started doing my own research in the early 1970s. And I'm kind of obsessive compulsive. My research, most comic book research up to that point was anecdotal. People just passing on stories back and forth from things that they'd heard, throughout the industry or over the years. But the problem with that is many times it's flawed because people's memories fail, people forget, people skew facts and everything. What I decided to do was treat comic books just like you would any other historical subject. And I did a hardcore research. I mean, I started, I would go through newspaper archives, and this was all pre-internet. So you had to get your hands dirty and, dig through old newspapers, and I would, get books that had been out of print, for years. I would interview whoever I could who knew these men, whenever I got that opportunity. But I ran into a problem when it came to Matt Baker. Matt Baker was always one of my favorite artists. He's one of the greatest comic book artists of all time. And in my opinion, he's one of the three most influential comic book artists of the golden age comics. You have Jack Kirby, you have Will Eisner, and you have Matt Baker. And the first two, pretty much everybody knows and understands why they're important. But with Matt Baker, he totally changed the way comic books were presented on the newsstand. It was no longer just, you just slapped the cover on a comic and you just stuck whatever inside. Each cover he would do was literally an eye-catching work of art. And Baker's forte was beautiful women. And that's something that, it changed the industry. He brought sex to comics, in other words. Just like guys like Gil Evgren and Petty and Alberto Vargas were doing in men's magazines, Matt Baker did for comic books. And when he came on the scene in the mid-40s, he just changed the entire industry for good and for bad, because a lot of attention was placed on comic books afterwards, but that's later on in the story. But Baker is basically the impetus behind this entire research that I did, because when I first began this, it was over 20 years ago, there wasn't much known about Matt Baker, other than the fact that most people knew that he was black. And there was always the story that was told most often was he's the only black comic book artist who worked in comics in the 1940s. And that always seemed really strange to me, because just statistically, it made no sense. How could there only be one black man to have worked in the comic book industry out of the thousands of people who worked in comics during that time? So I tried researching Baker in normal ways, but there was never anything in the newspapers. There was hardly anything in books that I didn't already know. So finally, one other historian I was speaking with, he said, "Hey, have you ever talked to Mr. Samuel Joyner?" I said, "No." I said, "Who is he?" And he says, "He's a retired black editorial cartoonist from Philadelphia." And he said, and Mr. Joyner knew everybody from the 1940s. At that time, he was like in his 80s. And he said, and he knew a lot of these men. He says, "Why don't you write to him?" And so I got his address and I wrote to him. Well, many times when you write to people, especially back in the day, and it's just a cold, like a cold call, you don't hear anything back. Mr. Joyner wrote me a 4-page letter, detailed letter, and sent me all these clippings from different black magazines and newspapers. And there was stuff about Baker, a few things about Elmer Stoner, and one thing was about Jay Jackson. Well, I knew Elmer Stoner, and I had heard the name Jay Jackson, but I'd never made the connection that they were all black artists. So I wrote back to Mr. Joyner right away, and I said, "Can you tell me a little more?" Well, he met a lot of these men. In 1950, him and another black artist named Cal Massey, they were both from Philadelphia, and they graduated from high school, and they took a trip to New York, and they visited the studios of all these different men. They visited E. Sims Campbell, for instance, who was a famous commercial artist. And one of the people they visited was Matt Baker. They actually went to Matt Baker's studio, and he sat there and he had pages of artwork, and he discussed with them, different aspects of working in the comic book industry. Well, that just flipped a switch in me. I go, I got to know more about this. But the problem is that any of the normal resources I went to, like newspapers, had nothing about any of these men. And so I started thinking about it. I said, there has to be more about it. You know, these men existed. So what I did is I started looking for Black newspapers and Black media, Black magazines, books written by Black writers. And all of a sudden, I found this entire world that I'd never seen before. And the problem was, especially back in the day, is unlike white newspapers, libraries didn't keep copies of Black newspapers. Like you could always find runs of the New York Times or runs of the Detroit Free Press or whatever. You couldn't find runs of the Baltimore Afro-American. You couldn't find runs of Chicago Defender. So I had to do this all piecemeal. And, you know, I started finding them in different libraries, and finally when the internet came around, I was able to locate short runs of different newspapers in different spots all around the country. And the long story short, it took me 20 years to figure this all out, but I had to, like I say, it was like entering a different world, because this is a world that I never had read about, because, you know, I'd always studied history, but you know, we were always exposed to just one version of history. And it's, you know, the history that, you know, the white man is taught, you know, all these years. And there's an awful lot that's not taught. And I've learned an awful lot about, you know, the Black experience just from reading these Black newspapers. Because I wouldn't just read an article about a comic book artist. I would read the entire newspaper. And I just immersed myself in that entire world. And I read W.E.B's The Soul Black Folks, for instance, and that was probably the most eye-opening of all the books I read, because it's an essay, but he talks about double consciousness in there. And this was written in 1903. And what he was speaking about was how a Black person existed in two worlds. They were forced to live in two worlds. Their world, which was the Black community and the people they knew and the people they lived with, and then the white world, where they generally would work jobs. You know, they would have jobs most often is like, you know, railroad porters and waiters and things like that. And it was a duality that I didn't really understand until I read that. And that's how I started seeing the story of these men. And I also parallel it to Invisible Men, the book, you know, by Ralph Ellison, where he speaks about, you know, the double consciousness in the book. That's what you know, his book is about. And it all just came to me. You know, it was like an epiphany. You know, I just started realizing, I say, I get it. You know, and anyways, I spent 20 years then finding each one of these men, as many as I could. You know, one story would lead to a mention of another person, or I would find, you know, a line or two about one man somewhere else, and I just started connecting all the stories, and I was able to put together a rough idea of what, you know, their experience was. That each one had an individual experience, but overall, it gave me a better view of what the Black experience was, especially as it pertained to comic books.
Well,
amazing.
you know, can you give us the historical context in which comic books came into? I mean, we're talking 1940s, 1950s.
Right.
The historical context in which comic books came into popularity, because at this time we obviously had our pulp books, and we had comic strips. And show us what was the context in which comic books.
Well, okay, our concept of what a comic book is today basically started in the 1930s. There was a 1929 comic called The Funnies, which was sort of like a proto comic book. It was really in the 1930s. In the beginning, comic books were a giveaway premium. They were just an advertising gift that was given away, but with different products. And what they did was, in the beginning, is they just collected newspaper comic strips and they reprinted them in a smaller form and put them in a comic book, and they give it away to kids. Well, after a guy named Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson came up with the idea of creating original comic book material. He came out with a comic book called New Fun, and that basically changed the comic book industry, because what it did was, all of a sudden, they're no longer just doing reprints. They actually had to have artists and writers creating material for comic books, to print, to create original comic books. And ironically enough, in the very first original comic book, in the first issue of New Fun, there was a black artist in it, and his name was Adolph Barreau, which was a pseudonym of a man who was named Adolphus Grippon, and that we'll talk about his story some other time. But that was 1935, and from that, the comic book industry really took off in 1938 with the creation of Superman. And I don't have to tell you how popular he became. And it just took the whole world by storm, because comic books by 1940 were selling in the hundreds of millions of issues every year. And but all of a sudden, with the advent of World War II, it changed the dynamic in the industry, because what happened is that when the United States entered the war at the end of 1941, and the draft was instated, and they started calling up all the able-bodied men, the first people they called up were the able-bodied white men, because ironically enough, even though black men were eligible for the draft, local draft boards wouldn't take them. They would purposely skip over them because they didn't want them in the military with the white guys. So they were drafting almost exclusively white men until 1943. But what happened because of that, it created this gap in employment through all different industries, like an auto industry here in Detroit. That's where the Rosita Riveters all came from, when women started taking over their jobs. And in the comic book industry, they started hiring, there were some, women were hired, and that's when black men broke through. And the first of those who really broke through was Elmer Stoner, and he started in 1939. And Mr. Stoner was the one who sort of like paved the way for other artists after him. He would help them get jobs. And it became a whole industry within an industry, because black artists all work for what they called comic shops. And I know I'm getting really deep in the weeds here, but what a comic shop was they were studios. And most comic book companies didn't have in-house staffs at the time. They didn't have their own artists and writers. What they would do is they would go to these comic shops, and they would order as many comics as they needed. Like, say, just for instance, you might have Quality Comics, and they would go to the Eisner studio and say, we need 5 comic books, 5 64-page comic books by the end of this month. And Jerry Iger, who owned the studio, in turn would go and hire as many artists and writers as he needed to produce those comics. Well, what happened was this provided an entryway for black artists, because the comic studios acted as a buffer between the black artist and the white publishers. White publishers probably wouldn't have hired black artists if they just walked into their office off the street. And I spoke to several different people, including Mr. Joyner, who told me that happened to him personally. And this was later on in the 40s. So what would happen is these studios, who weren't particular about who they hired as long as they had artists, would hire these black artists to do the work. And most of the black artists would work out of their own home. Like Alvin Hollingsworth was a good example. He spoke about this, where they would do the work at home in their home studios. Then they would drop it off at the comic shop, and the comic shop would turn it into the publisher. So the publisher.
I actually had a question about that, because
sure.
One of the things that you referenced was W.E. Du Bois and how he spoke about the duality of existence of being Black in America.
Mm-hmm.
How did that duality of living in these two worlds affect these early Black comic creators? Because on top of being Black and having to deal with that, then they're also working in this added factor of the comic book industry, which was really specifically, I think in your book, you mentioned it specifically geared for white males at the time.
Correct.
And then to have the inability to even sort of work amongst their peers and having to work out of their homes and have a second job, etc. What was the effects of that duality?
Well, it's interesting you ask that, Paul, because most of these Black comic book artists were successful outside of comic books, but they were successful in the Black media, or they were successful in fine art. Like, for instance, Elmer Stoner was a commercial artist. He was one of the only two Black artists I know who broke through into commercial art, which was almost exclusively a white field. So he had that career outside of comics, and he was also a well-known painter, a fine artist. His stuff is in the National Museum in Washington. He even has artwork. Same thing with Robert Pius. Robert Pius was already an established Black artist and probably the best known political cartoonist in the Black media from the 1940s right up to the 1970s. If you read any Black newspaper that appeared during that time period from the 40s to the 70s, you'll see Robert Pius political cartoons. And it goes on and on. Elton Fax was an established Black artist. He was from Baltimore, but he worked in comic books. And he did a lot of work for the NAACP. He created some of the most famous posters. I reproduced one of them in the book. It's a famous poster of Jim Crow being strangled. And that was created by Elton Fax. But each one of these men had a full, thriving career in their Black world, but they were unknown, totally unknown in the white world, even amongst their supposed peers in the comic book industry. I've interviewed numerous white artists over the years I've been doing this, who worked in the 1940s, and almost none of them had ever met a Black artist other than Matt Baker or Alvin Hollingsworth. They claimed, I had numerous artists tell me there was no Black artist other than Matt Baker, and they told me that's my face. Well, obviously there were. They just never saw them.
Right.
And it's such a bizarre thing to think about. That the schism was so wide that they literally didn't see them. Again, that's part of the reason why I called the book Invisible Men. They literally were kept apart, and they didn't have the opportunity. Yet these men were highly successful in, like I say, Elmer Stoner, trained in France, is a fine artist and, some incredibly talented artist. And yet they were totally unknown by their white peers, who most times were nowhere near as talented as them. It's unbelievable, Paul. It's just, like I said, when I was reading this, I'll be honest with you, I was ashamed and embarrassed reading it as a white person, okay? And I don't know if it's a hard thing for people to understand, but it was humbling for me to read all this stuff, and all this stuff, for me to realize it. It took years for me to piece all this together. But, you could read the stories of men in the book here. Almost all of them had successful careers outside of comics.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
They truly were the invisible men.
Yeah. And like I say, Paul, it's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating piece of not just Black history, but of American history that, people don't know. And I think that's part of the reason why the stories in this book have appealed to so many people. I've heard from so many people from outside the comic book industry who've read this, who thanked me for it, because they said they never knew, this part of history. And, it just makes me feel good. I mean, I think as human beings, we need to understand our past more. And I don't know. I get all emotional in a way when I think about all this. But
look, it's perfectly understandable. This is why your book is so important, and why we have you here, and why we encourage everyone to go out and buy this book, and more importantly, read this book.
Yeah. Your comments about the research you had to do, the newspapers that you had to dig up to consolidate all this information and make sense of it and put it into an actual narrative of what was happening. It's truly amazing. And once again, not it's the first but not the last, advertisement. If you don't have this book, get it and read it. It's available on Amazon. If you want to go through the Black Comic Lords website, you can click on our Amazon link at blackcomiclords.net. That'll help us out a little bit. But this is a great book, and it's a must-read for everybody in our community.
I wanted to mention real quick, Derek, this frustrated fan sports comment sounds like a lot of Black writers today. It's amazing that lack of recognition still, 100 years later is still sort of what we're going through today with many Black creators.
Mm-hmm. So we've spent a lot of time on Invisible Men, and you gave an initial introduction to Matt Baker, but I just want for those in the chat or watching this video who may not have heard of Matt Baker until listening to this show, right? Ken, could you give us a 1-minute elevator pitch on who Matt Baker was and what's his significance to the industry?
Okay, Matt Baker was preternaturally talented, probably one of the most naturally talented artists ever to work in comic books, and I mean ever. He had very little art training at all. As far as I've ever been able to determine, he only took one art class at the Cooper Union. But he's basically self-taught. He was born in North Carolina, grew up in Pittsburgh, and he started working in the comic book industry in 1943 when he was working, when he was taking his class at the Cooper Union. And he was just working in an office as his regular job. But he started working for this man named Jerry Iger, who at one time had been Will Eisner's partner. And Iger immediately recognized Baker's talent. If you look at old comic books, you could see that a lot of these people were just amateur level or just barely above. Baker was heads, many yards further along in his skill level than the rest of these guys. Well, he got this job with Iger's studio, and he was so important to Jerry Iger that Matt Baker actually had a table in the studio with the white artist. And he was what was called a penciler. And I don't know if your audience is aware, but most comic books falls into different jobs classifications. And usually there's one guy who does penciling, and another guy may do the inking of the comic. Well, in these comic shops, because at the time it was more important to produce material, and they're more concerned about quantity than quality. they set it up like an assembly line. You would have one guy pencil, and he would pass it to an inker. And after it was inked, he would pass it to another guy who would letter the page. And it would go on like that. And it was just like an assembly line. Well, the best artists were the pencilers. And Matt Baker was the best artist in the Iger studio. I got to know a guy named Al Feldstein late in his life. And me and Al used to talk about Matt Baker all the time, because when Al Feldstein got out of the service in 1945, he got a job with the Iger studio, and his drawing table, was directly next to Matt Baker. And so when Matt Baker would finish drawings with pencil and page, he would hand it to Al Feldstein, and he would ink it. And he would talk, he talked to me about it. And I said, well, did you become friends with him? He goes, Ken, he says, I'm embarrassed to tell you. He says, no. He says, because even though, we worked together and stuff like that, there was like a line that you couldn't cross. He said, when all the rest of the artists would go out to lunch or hang around and go out for drinks afterwards, Baker would go off by himself. He never hung around with the rest of the artists. But he was so talented that when he was drawing, a lot of times the other artists in the studio would leave their desk and come and just stand there and watch him draw, because he was so good. And his covers, especially the ones that featured women, were spectacular and so eye-catching. Like I said, prior to him, covers many times were a secondary thought. They just slap anything on. Most times they had nothing to do with the stories inside. It was just something to put, to cover the pages inside. Matt Baker changed that. And he brought sex to comic books. And everybody started copying him. Not just everybody in the Iger studio, but the entire comic book industry started copying Matt Baker. And it's always been a problem for art historians and people who specialize in identifying artists to figure out exactly everything that Matt Baker drew, because so many people were copying him that there was a lot of copies that are, taken right from his work. But he became so good and so much better than everybody else that later on in his career, especially when he worked for St. John later on, his covers they're literally masterpieces. In my mind, they could be in, like these two right here are from when he was working for the St. John Publishing Company. He started working for them in 1948 after he left the Iger studio and started freelancing. And he was hired by a guy named Archer St. John, who's this real far-sighted publisher. One of the first things Baker did was this picture novel called It Rhymes with Lust. And what it was an innovative idea for that time. It was a digest-sized comic book with an adult story, meaning that not adult in pornographic sense, but adult. It was aimed at adults instead of at kids. And it was a digest and fully illustrated. And the artist chosen to do it was Baker. And, he just had that ability. He was just so much better than everybody else. That's why St. John picked him to do this. And St. John respected Baker so much, he made him the art director of his entire publishing company, which is almost mind-boggling when you consider the challenges that, Black people were going through at the time. And for this big-time publisher to make him an art director over all these other artists, including at the same time work for the same company was guys like Joe Kubert and Alex Toth worked for him for a while, and a bunch of other famous artists. But the person picked as the art director was Matt Baker. And if you want to flip to some of the other covers he did there, I mean, it was just one way after another, like that Cinderella love cover there. Look at the detail of that. Just look at the beauty of that cover and compare it to most other comic books of the same time period.
That's
This other cover next to it is from Canteen Kate, #1. And that's one of Canteen Kate was a character that Baker and a writer named Dana Dutch created. And it was hilarious. It was a funny comic, and it was gorgeously drawn. It's probably my all-time favorite Golden Age comic. It was a short run series. I ran for 3 issues, and then she ran in a bunch of backup stories and other comics. But it's just a brilliantly drawn comic book. But Baker was just so far ahead of everybody else at the time. But unfortunately, just as he was really hitting his stride, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. The publisher, Archer St. John, wanted to expand his company. So he published a magazine called Nugget, which was a knockoff of Playboy. And the artist he hired, the artist he put in charge of doing illustrations for it, was Matt Baker. And for the first time in his life, Baker was doing commercial art, which is what he wanted to do ever since high school. He wanted to be a commercial artist. And he was finally doing the same sort of stuff that like Alberto Vargas was doing. And he started illustrating for some magazines. But then in August 1955, Archer St. John died of a drug overdose. And the next week, he died over the weekend. His wife came in on a Monday and she fired everybody in the company. And they just farmed out the artwork to another studio, and Baker lost his job. And he was basically just left adrift. Afterwards, he just picked up jobs wherever he could. He did Lassie for Dell, which is weird, even thinking about it, but he drew Lassie comics for about 10 issues. He did some stuff for Atlas Comics, which is the precursor for Marvel. But it's sort of like he lost his his will or something like that. It's because his artwork just wasn't the same after the fall of St. John, because he was churning out this beautiful artwork, and he did hundreds of covers while he was at St. John in stories. But towards the end of his career, the last couple of years of his career in the late 50s, it just wasn't the same. And in 1959, his half brother stopped by his apartment, and he walks inside. Baker didn't answer the door, and he found him laying on the floor, dead of a heart attack. And he was only 37 years old. Baker had always had heart issues going back to childhood. As a matter of fact, that's what kept him out of the service. And he is a heavy smoker and everything, but he died way, way too young, because who knows if he'd survived a few years later. He was working for Marvel already. He would have been probably one of Marvel's top artists right from the get-go. He was already working for Stan Lee.
Rich?
Yes. Mr. Ken, want to talk to you about one particular book in general, one character, actually. Crown Comics #3.
Right.
This is a book that is very sought after in our community.
Yep.
It is the first appearance of a character called Vooda. And
Right.
the question is, Matt Baker created this character, right? He's the first Black hero featured in a comic book. He created this character. We're just curious as to how did he really feel about Vooda, and did he have an idea that this character would be or have historical significance?
Well, that's interesting you asked that, Rich, because from all the comics that I researched I've read thousands and thousands of Golden Age comics. Vooda, I believe, was snuck in by Baker. I think that he just got it by the editor who wasn't paying attention, because their editors at that time had no inclination to create a Black hero. There was no other Black hero in any comic books, and if they ever appeared in a comic book, they were always caricatures. They were, they had these minstrel type characters, and it was embarrassing. The black characters that would appear in comic books. Vooda appeared at a time when what they called jungle comics were popular. You had characters like Sheena and all these different characters. Mula, and most of them were white women wearing like leopard skin outfits. And occasionally they would have like Mula. They were white jungle lords, they used to call them. And amazingly, the jungles were full of all these white men running around, saving all the black people in Africa. Well, somehow Baker got this story past his editors. It was probably just because they were producing so many stories, nobody noticed it at the time. Because Vooda appeared as a black man only for 3 issues. And then suddenly he becomes white in the comic book. They start coloring him white. And Baker wasn't drawing him anymore at that time. And he never appeared on the covers. Even when he would appear black in the inside comic, he would never be colored as a black man on the cover. And that was more than likely done because distributors down south notoriously would pull comics off the stand if they thought it was they had a positive black character in it. For instance, All Negro Comics was a good example of that. When that came out in 1947, a lot of distributors in the South wouldn't even handle it. They wouldn't even put it on the newsstand because it portrayed blacks positively. So
one of the interesting things you noted, you said that Matt might have snuck it by his editor.
Right.
And here's what I'm thinking, because Derek and I were having this debate or this discussion earlier before we started this. When you see Vooda's image there, he is colored black, but his hair is straight. And it wasn't just because if you look at the other black characters, particularly the woman who's there, she obviously has an afro. Right. So that was like a stylistic choice on his part to make Vooda with the straight hair, which is the same image that you have when they eventually made Vooda white. So I'm like wondering whether he might have given his editor the uncolored version, and that's how he was able to sneak it past.
To be honest, Paul, we're just trying to read his mind here, okay? And it's hard to know because the coloring was done separately from the artwork, obviously, but it's the artist who generally picks the coloring. They're the ones who will make notations on the artwork saying like, color this red or color this blue. And so somebody had to say, give Vooda dark skin, okay? And more than likely, it was Baker because he was the artist on it. So he may have drawn it, when you just look at comic book artwork, it's just black and white. An editor just looking at the page may not even noticed, that he was supposed to be a black man, but probably Baker's notations to the colorist were color his skin dark. Right. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
So the coloring was added after he did the artwork, but he was the one who had to give the instructions in the first place. So that's why I believe it was done where he snuck it by the editor who wasn't paying attention. The editor was dealing with dozens, if not hundreds of pages of artwork, flipping through them, and he just wanted to make sure it was all done and looked good. He wasn't worried about notations about coloring and stuff like that, And I believe that Baker just snuck it by him because I've seen that with other artwork. There's a comic book called Rocket Kelly, and the cover was drawn by E.C. Stoner, who was a black artist. Well, what's interesting about this cover is that it shows a rocket ship taking off but it's not taking off from the United States, and it's not taking off from Europe like most. It shows the world, okay, and it shows continents on the Earth, but it shows the rocket taking off from the center of Africa, okay. And I believe that sometimes the black artists would sneak in little things like that, just to sort of like, as an Easter egg kind of thing.
I got to find that book.
Right. Oh yeah, check it out. It's Rocket Kelly, I believe, #3. I wish I had a copy of it. I don't have a copy. I'm trying to buy one, but Rocket Kelly #3. And it's
You can be sure the people watching this are probably on eBay right now trying to look that up.
Oh yeah. Well, see, I just killed myself. I did that when I published this thing here. And I go like, well, all these comics I wrote about are all worth more now than I can afford anymore. But
oh, speaking of, you've got your copy of Crown Comics, right? Do you want to show that? There it is.
Wow. And that's a nice colorful copy too.
Yeah, actually it's in great shape. And I picked it up a few years ago when, before I wrote about it and stuff like that, or else I couldn't afford it now. I'm sure. One of you guys would outbid me, that happens to me all the time.
It's funny. These jungle comics were very popular as a genre in the comic book world, the comic book medium in the 40s and 50s. As you mentioned, most of the time these protagonists in these stories were white people who were the white savior trope, where they'd wear the leopard skins to show that they're the kings or queens of the jungle, right. So they can save all the black Africans that have been there for 1,000,000 years. Right. Given what happened with Vooda in the color change between Crown Comics 3 and 5, and just many of these jungle stories in general, particularly the ones that are done by black artists, but for the racism of the time, do you think many of those protagonists actually would have been done as black characters instead?
If not for the racism, it's obviously because of the racism. Because, Paul, the racism at that time was just taken for granted. It was part of American society. It probably didn't even dawn on them to feature a black character, right, at the time. And,
it was obviously a popular genre, and naturally you would think you would just make a black hero.
I know. Yeah, I mean, like for instance, one of the stories published in the book, or at least I mentioned here, was Jay Jackson, where he was a black, mainly a comic strip artist, and he worked in black media mostly. He did a little bit of comic book work, but he did a comic strip called Speed Jackson, right around, actually even predates Vooda. And in Speed Jackson, one of the things that the character does, he's a well-educated black man who went to Africa he was working for the federal government, I believe, or something like that. He was like a spy working for the federal government. Well, he goes to Africa to fight against some Nazis. Now, this is during World War II. He lands in a country that's an advanced race of black people, okay, which is very much like Wakanda, okay, but this is more than 20 years before, the Black Panther and, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, but it's an advanced race, city that's all by itself that nobody knew about. It was like a hidden city. It's almost exactly like Wakanda.
It's in a book that's right behind over Derek's head.
No, I don't have that one. I just have the other Jay Jackson, Bundles in Green.
Jay Jackson,
Yeah,
but it's a fascinating run if you get to read it, And actually, I can't tell you guys this full thing because I have to wait till somebody else allows me to reveal it. There was a black superhero creator in the comic strips earlier than anybody knows, and it was created by one of the guys who appears in this book here. And I'll have to save that for some other time to tell you guys about it because I'm not allowed to tell right now.
Oh, no Black Comic Lords exclusive. No.
That is a very close near Black Comic Lords exclusive.
Well, I mean, if I can, I say if I can get permission, because I will show you examples of it. It's a full-fledged black superhero from about 1942. Okay,
42.
and this is not any pseudo or proto superhero. This is a superhero who is a black superhero and was created by one of the 18 guys who appears in this book. But I can't tell you guys right now, and it's killing me.
Just promise us you'll give us the exclusive.
I'll give you an exclusive as soon as I get permission to do it.
That's what's up. We'll bring you on.
Okay.
So so
go ahead, Derek.
Yeah. So you mentioned that a lot of folks know that Matt Baker was black.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, at least more so in people that are in my age range, a lot of people know of Matt Baker. They see Matt Baker covers, but I'm surprised that in the number of situations which I see, they actually don't know that he was black, or even if they do, they don't let on. It's not, to them, it's not important. These are mainstream folks. So I always wonder why that is, why they don't know or don't necessarily care. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I actually find that surprising, because as influential as he was to other artists, and like I say, I've talked to numerous artists who worked during that time period, and artists later on. I mean, if you were to talk to, I'm trying to think of some of the artists who you guys might know who've mentioned Baker, but a lot of professionals, especially ones who worked in the Silver Age, were admirers of Matt Baker. I mean, he's the one who showed comic books how to depict a woman. It's before that you had the Lois Lanes and everything, and they're always sort of like in the background. Yeah, you had Wonder Woman, but you had that bizarre Harry Peter version of Wonder Woman, which was all kind of Baroque drawing. It wasn't sexy or anything like that, but Matt Baker made women sexy, and there's no doubt about it. And believe me, as 12-year-old boys who were buying the comic books, they went crazy over these comics, and it changed the entire industry, and it brought a lot of unwanted scrutiny though later on. I mean, that's one of the things that caused Dr. Wordham and a lot of these politicians in the 1950s to go after comic books, was the depiction of women. And if you read Seduction of the Innocent and you look at some of the pictures in there, some of those are Matt Baker drawings. So, it was a double-edged sword in that sense, but people just weren't ready for it at the time.
Hey, Ken, we had one question in the chat from that book you mentioned that you can't talk about yet, but it says, was that 1942 hero book ever published?
It wasn't a book, it was comic strip.
Oh, was it published?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I have examples of it.
All right.
And like I say, as soon as I get an opportunity, I get to go ahead and do it. See, that's one of the bad things about doing what I do is I'm privy to a lot of information sometimes, and people always say, like, don't do it until such and such happens, or promise me you won't say anything right away. So I know all sorts of stuff I can't even talk about.
That's all good. We'll bring you back. This is another excuse to bring you back.
So Ken, another question I have is there anything noteworthy about Matt Baker that you feel that most people don't know?
Well, okay, there's one thing that it's always surrounded Matt Baker, which has been debated back and forth. And there was always rumors that he was gay. One of his best friends who worked with him at the Irish studio was a guy named Frank Giusto, I believe you pronounce the name, Giusto. And they were good friends and everything. And he's been quoted as saying is that Baker was gay. He had no proof of it, but he claimed that the way he put it is Baker had the hots for him, okay, whatever that means. But at the same time, other people who knew Matt Baker, especially his brother John, he had a half brother named John, who he may still be alive, but he was alive up until a few years ago. He swears up and down he was not gay. As a matter of fact, Matt had a longtime girlfriend, and he had a lot of women he would date because he's such a good-looking guy, and he had a big fancy convertible. I forgot what kind of car it was. It was a big yellow convertible and stuff like that. But I've seen pictures of him, and like I said, that top right photo there comes from a portfolio of glamour shots that he had done of himself, and that, he was quite the ladies' man. He's a real snappy dresser and everything about him, just really classy guy, and I think that kind of played into it. I think there was some jealousy there because not all these comic book guys were the sharpest sharpest dressers around, and I just think there was a lot of jealousy there. Plus, there's the bigotry too. Who knows? People say things just to be mean. I mean, there's a photograph of Matt Baker sitting with all these people in the Archer St. John's office with Archer St. John and a couple other artists, and he's holding it's a Christmas party, and he's holding a little stuffed monkey, and he looks really ticked off, okay? And it's like, I'm sure somebody gave it to him. It's like a joke or something like that, because people are just very mean and insensitive stuff. I mean, there's an anecdote in the book about a conversation that Alvin Hollingsworth had with Stan Lee. I don't know if you guys remember reading that in the book there, but Stan Lee started making jokes about, Calvin Massey, not Alvin Hollingsworth. But Calvin Massey was speaking to Stan Lee, and Stan Lee started making jokes about Massey's last name, about Massey something or other, like Master. And he tried, it was just very insulting and derogatory, but that's the sort of thing that, the white people do. And it's just, the bigotry was blatant and right out there. And I think there, Matt, there it is. Yeah, that's the photo right there. I mean, he doesn't look too happy. At that picture there, the rest of the people think it's hilarious. We discussed that quite a bit when we came across that photo. So
Do you have an educated guess of how much uncredited work Matt Baker may have actually done?
Oh, gosh. Derek, again, it's so hard to tell because he was doing so much. And especially like when he was with the Eisner Studio, he was penciling so much, but it was inked by all different artists. And so it's hard to tell sometimes what was his because it's buried beneath the inks of other people. Like you would have Al Feldstein ink one page, you would have Ray Ostlund ink another, you'd have Fred Justo ink another. So there's all these different people inking it, and it's hard to tell sometimes what, where Matt Baker appeared and where he didn't. But there's no doubt he probably did thousands of pages, and I know he did hundreds of covers, especially once he was at St. John from 1950 through from about 1949 to 1955. He drew hundreds of covers just for St. John Comics alone. I just wish there was a comprehensive book that would, would encompass all his work. It would be like a full accounting for all his work in that, because it's worth it. It's, he's so worth it.
Yeah, amazing artist.
Yeah.
Mr. Ken, my question is a couple questions actually. But given the appearance of Matt Baker's being a private person, he seemed to exhibit. Do you think that helped his career or it hurt his career? Because there were these innuendos about who he was and things of that nature, and being off to himself. So I was just curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it probably hurt it, because again, Rich, he wasn't hanging out with the boys. He wasn't out there with all the rest of them. And I'm sure there's opportunities he lost out on because of that. Just most of the black artists, once the white artists came back from World War II, were forced out of jobs. They lost their jobs, and the white artists took over. He was one of the few. Him and Alvin Hollingsworth and a couple others were a handful who continued working in comic books. And all the rest of them lost their jobs, like Ezra Jackson is a good example. And he was very bitter about that. You know, he was working in comic books, but as soon as the white guys came back, he lost his job. And I'm sure that's why Baker stayed a private person, because he just didn't want the trouble that, you know, probably would come from, you know, the other artist. I mean, some of those guys in these studios were just mean, nasty people. Like Bob Powell was known to be a racist and a misogynist and everything like that. He got punched out by George Tuska one time for something he said to a woman. And it was just, you know, it was a tough environment. And especially if you were the only black man in a room, saying with 30 white guys, you know, you can just imagine the, you know, the pressure that was on him all the time.
Gotcha. So what in your opinion, where do you think Matt Baker stands in regards to his influence on the artistry of comics beyond the situation with the Comics Code Authority? You know, I guess that's my question, but my follow-up question to that is, do you think that this has been in our space, we kind of pride ourselves in unveiling and shedding light and things of that nature. Do you think that Matt Baker is or has his just due?
No, definitely not. Without a doubt, no. Because to me, like I said earlier, he's one of the three most influential Golden Age artists. And, you know, he should be ranked right up there. Just, you know, maybe not quite as influential as Jack Kirby or maybe Will Eisner, you know, but I can't think of any other Golden Age artist who is more important to the industry as a whole than Matt Baker. And yet, there's so many people who are consider themselves comic historians and collectors of, you know, older Golden Age comics who don't even know Matt Baker. Like you said, Derek, even younger black artists don't even know the name Matt Baker or know that he was black. And to me, that's a crime. I mean, because this, like I said, this man was so phenomenally talented and so important to the comic book industry as a whole. I mean, his covers probably accounted for millions of dollars in sales for different publishers over the years. Yeah, he didn't make $1 million. And, you know, as much as people cry about Jack Kirby or some of these other artists who never, you know, made as much money as they should have, what about someone like Matt Baker? How much money was made off of his talent? And he ended up with nothing. He was fired, like I say, they came in on a Monday morning and fired him. Him and everybody else in the office just got rid of him. You know, and so he just was doing freelancing and just barely getting by, you know, until he died a couple years later. You know, and he definitely didn't get his just due. I mean, to me, there should be an award named after him. I try to, this is just between us and the thousands of people who, you know, on your site, but I tried getting my publisher to sponsor an award called the Baker Stoner Award. It would be named after Matt Baker and Elmer Stoner. And I didn't want any profits from the book to go toward it. There'd be a sponsorship for a minority artist starting out. I tried getting them to do it, and you can see where that's gotten. So I don't want to get on my soapbox about that, but it's something I'm not too happy about.
I love that idea.
One last question, sir. You talked about the industry, and I'm just curious. Do you know any famed artists that do acknowledge Matt Baker as an influence?
Well, I know Al Feldstein was one for sure. You know, and I knew him personally. I knew him really well. Anybody who was in that studio at that time and that would include guys like Jack Kamen, who ended up at EC. Try to think who else. Bob Lubers, who became a very well-known Golden Age artist, and he later ended up working for Al Cap. Gosh, who's some of the other artists you guys may know? But any artist who came out of that time period, acknowledges the influence of Baker. And, there's unfortunately not too many left around, to speak with. But almost all of them, the ones who worked in the 1940s and 50s especially, acknowledge his talent. And even guys, when you get the guys like, gosh, I can't even think of his name right now. The one who did all the Betty Page stuff in recent years. Oh God, I can't think of his name. Oh, Adam Hughes, for instance. And Adam Hughes is definitely owes a debt to Matt Baker. And other artists like that. You guys are old enough to remember the whole phase comics went through in the 90s there, where all the bad girls were on covers and comic book covers, stuff like that. That's basically just like a latter day version of what Matt Baker did, only yet nowhere near as well done.
Right.
But where do you think all that stuff came from? He's the one who brought that to comic books.
Yeah, guys like Adam Hughes and Frank Cho.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
J. Scott Campbell. These guys are just emulating what he did.
Exactly. And I'm sure if you talk to them, especially Adam Hughes and stuff like that, they'll acknowledge that Matt Baker was definitely an influence on him. He had to be. It's so obvious. And like I say, when you go back and look at comic books from about 1945 to the mid 50s, when the Comics Code started, and you look at the covers on whether it was a military comic or it was a crime comic or it was a Western comic, and you see girls front and center on there, you can thank Matt Baker for that, because he's the one who created that whole concept, that whole idea. And yet nobody gives him credit for that, and I don't know, that sort of stuff drives me crazy. Like I say, I've been trying for years, to get awards named after these guys and get more recognition for them, and nobody listens to me. So
his work revolutionized the industry. I mean,
it did.
It's still used to this day, that concept.
Right. I mean, just look at even comic covers today.
Right.
Anytime you see like a cheesecake type pose on a cover, I don't care what it is, they owe a debt to Matt Baker. Because look at comic books before Matt Baker and look at comic books after Matt Baker. It's so obvious, it's not even funny, and it's owed to one man. Think about that. As much as Jack Kirby gave to comic books with superheroes, the way you should draw superheroes, Matt Baker changed the comic book cover. It's his concepts that changed the way comic books were made.
And speaking of covers, is there one that is one of your favorites or your favorite Matt Baker cover?
There's so many, Derek. It's hard for me. It's like asking, one of my favorite kids. But I love his romance stuff that he did later on. Some of that stuff to me is just, it's almost breathtaking, because I'm a trained artist. That's why I spent 20 years in college, it seems like, learning. But it's exquisite, especially for the time period. Compare Matt Baker stuff to anything else that came out in 1952 or 1953 there. And it's one right after another. Like I said, I just went and grabbed the whole pile of comics. This is all Matt Baker comics. I got in here, different covers he did. He just did all sorts of stuff.
If there was a particular comic that you would deem his all right, let's say the top 3 most important works by Matt Baker, what would you say?
Well, Phantom Lady for sure. Okay, that's the one that everybody associates with him. Phantom Lady is probably the comic that he's not only best known for. It's iconic. That cover right there, Phantom Lady number 17, is probably one of the most famous images in comics. Matter of fact, Adam Hughes has done a version of that cover. I'm sure you guys have seen it. That Seven Seas cover is a classic. I personally like the Canteen Kate artwork, but that's story-wise and stuff like that. Even though Baker's not known so much for his interior work, he did some brilliant interior artwork too, which he doesn't get credit for.
Yeah.
And it's just one right after another. It's
yeah, one of the things with those early Black artists as well, I don't think it was until the 1970s. I have the issue. I don't remember what issue it was, but they never got to put their names on the covers.
That was sort of throughout the entire industry. It wasn't just restricted to Black artists. Okay. And if they did, a lot of times they would sneak it on there. E.C. Stoner was good for that. He would sneak it on there. I have a Blue Beetle cover where he put his initials, E.C., in the headlights of a train that's coming forward. And, they would sneak it on there a lot of times. That's what I'm saying. A lot of times they would do stuff like subversive kind of stuff, to get their names published. But the reason why they did that is they specifically weren't allowed to by the studios they worked for, because the studios didn't want people concentrating on a particular artist. They just wanted them, like, for instance, if you did Sheena, they just wanted people to think that only one person did Sheena, and they figured most people didn't pay attention to a specific artist. And so they would white out names, as a matter of fact. I have original artwork where they whited out, like, Alvin Hollingsworth's name and stuff like that, just because they didn't want the person's name on the on the artwork. But it wasn't just Black artists. Really, artists didn't start getting credit until EC Comics, and then later on, of course, in the 1960s, with Marvel. But prior to that, a lot of comic book artists were anonymous.
Yeah.
All right. So, there's so much to talk about here. I just want to, first of all, just thank you for coming to spend a little bit of time with us tonight. Another thing I want to mention to the chat is, we're thinking about doing another one. So obviously, this book, Invisible Men, is a great book. I liken it to somebody having found some of the manuscripts that were in the Library of Alexandria.
Wow.
Somehow, and putting them back together and piecing together what we lost. So I feel that's what you've done. So if you don't have this book, check it out. It's available on Amazon. It's a great read, and Mr. Quattro is not only covering the people, but he's also covering the times. The research. Just reading about the backstory, not only of Matt Baker, but his parents and grandparents, to understand, where they came from. You don't always get that in some of the books that you read about people, but you get them in this book. So check this book out. And we are thinking about having a follow-up. So 2 more individuals that we thought about that would be great would be Owen Middleton and Adolphus Barreau Griplin. They had divergent paths to become accomplished. I'll just leave it at that. So, chat, would love to get your feedback. Would you like to hear more from Mr. Quattro? I definitely would. I'd like to have a follow-up. So let us hear your thoughts.
Yeah. And then, you can also let us hear your thoughts through the super chat.
Oh yeah, the super chat, and maybe we'll do the video right at the tail end. Every time we get a super chat, Ken, we play a little video if you're okay, we'll do it now because we did get one super chat earlier.
Uh-oh.
So
Okay.
shout out to Dion for dropping us some love in the super chat. This is for
Thank you.
Dion.
Thank you, Dion, behind the scene. Here we go.
Donation. It's a donation. I thought it was the trash. Don't be hitting on me.
Thank you.
I love it. That's great.
So, Dion, thank you. I appreciate that. And also want everybody to remember, we always want to give our statements about the importance of pre-ordering your comics, because if you don't know, you haven't heard us tell you this before, we'll tell you again now. Pre-ordering your comics before the final order cutoff is the way to make sure that your order counts. It's like your vote. And this tells the publisher directly that somebody is buying this book. If you just go to the comic book store and pick it up off the shelf, it's great that you bought the book, but that book was going to be ordered anyway. When you order before the final order cutoff, you're adding one more order to the total number of books being ordered, which increases the chance that it's going to stay alive. So do that for your favorite series and artists.
Uh-oh.
We got another one.
Hit us up again.
More Quattro. Okay, that's a vote. That's a vote for Mr. Quattro. All right, another video. One more time.
Donation. It's a donation. I thought it was the trash. Don't be hitting on me.
Thank you.
I love that. That's great.
Thank you,
and
frustrated fan.
Yeah, thank you, frustrated fans. We appreciate you.
Robert Monroe says he wants to see more Ken. He has so much knowledge to share. And Phil's going crazy in the chat asking about pre-code horror was huge, and Baker made a contribution to that genre.
Yes, he did. He actually he did a little bit, not too much, but he did a little bit for St. John. He did especially he did a few covers. Gosh, I can't forget the name of the series it was on, but he did a few covers for St. John on the horror comics. But that really wasn't his thing. He was more into beauty more than horror. And he did some horror comics. He did crime comics, and but it was, the jungle and the romance comics that he's best known for. He could draw anything, though. I mean, I would have loved to see what he would have done with superhero comics if he'd
that would have been something else.
Had lived long enough to do it. I mean, just think about, say if he'd been there at the beginning with Marvel and they stuck him on one of the characters, who knows?
Change the game.
They would make him the X-Men or something like that, what's her name? June looked like, if he'd drawn her, or Sue Storm, or who knows, when you come up, or the Black Panther. Well, if he'd done the Black Panther, it's just mind-boggling if you think about it. The guy was only 37 when he died. He had so much more to give.
Yeah, and going back to this comment, take a look at the picture over here in Robert Monroe Jr.'s avatar. We've got the astronaut from Weird Fantasy.
I know the whole backstory of that too, but
yeah, that's for another day. So also
that was a minor flex, but between me and you.
So also, make sure you check out our recent specials. You can see on the right-hand side of the page here some of these interviews we've done. In addition to that, we've got our regularly recurring lives. So
yeah, that's it. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So on Fridays, Paul's got Wakanda whiskey and blurredom. Rich has got Rich on Sundays, and then our ladies' lives once a month as well. So we intend to keep those going. We intend to keep our creator series going as well. As you can see, you've had a lot. We're gonna keep on delivering for you. And Ken, there was something you're gonna say?
No, I just want to really thank you guys for having me on here, because it's like I say, anytime I have an opportunity to talk about these men, I mean, I think they were extraordinary, in their stories are extraordinary, and it's, they deserve as much exposure as they can get. And I noticed one of the people commented, they said that there should be a Baker Award that could be crowdfunded. you know, something could be done online or something like that, and I'm all for that. I mean, again, I still think that there should be some sort of either an award or some sort of scholarship, you know, for minority comic book artists or something like that. You know, young kids in high school who want to try to get into the comic book industry, you know, and really make a concerted effort. So back in the 1940s, they used to do that in New York schools. They used to, the comic book companies would sponsor kids in high schools. As a matter of fact, a couple of these black artists came out of that. They were in high school and they were picked up. Alfonso Green was one of them, was picked right out of high school to go work in the comic book industry. And I think the comic book industry could spend some of the millions of dollars they make off these movies and reinvest it into, you know, in bringing some artists along and giving them a shot. Personal opinion.
Yeah, definitely not a bad idea. Definitely not a bad idea. So, Ken, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We look forward to having you back really soon to talk about another topic from your book. Once again, one more reminder for everybody about the book. It is called Invisible Men. You can get it from most places where books are sold. Amazon is personal favorite. And like I said before, you can click on blackcomiclords.net, click on the link there. It'll take you straight to it. This is Derek for Paul and Rich. Hey, keep good this week. As Tamiko says, don't spend your rent money on comics, but make sure you read them. All right, everybody, take it easy.
Thank you.
Peace.